Well, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Nancy Easterbrook. I'm Executive Director of Silicon Valley Directors Exchange. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on why cybercriminals love work from home and what boards should do about it. SVDX is an organization dedicated to education and networking programs for boards of directors. We are hoping to post more of these virtual presentations until we can meet in person again, hopefully someday soon. I do want to thank our co-host for this webinar, Oric Law Firm. Thank you so much. And I'd like to introduce our speakers today, Tony Kim and Dan Siciliano. Tony Kim is a partner in Oric's cyber privacy and data innovation practice. He helps to navigate critical legal, risk, and reputational landmines when it comes to cyber attacks and data breaches. Dan Siciliano is chairman of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, as well as chairman of SVDX. Dan is a recognized expert in corporate strategy and governance, capital financial markets, and technological disruption. Today's webinar will run about 25 to 35 minutes of Tony and Dan discussing cybersecurity. And then after that, we will have some Q&A time. So I do encourage you to use the chat feature on Zoom to submit your questions anytime throughout the presentation. Additionally, we will be recording this session and we'll have it posted on our website in the coming weeks. So with that, I will turn it over to Dan.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. And thank you, Tony, for joining. We're super excited to have a pretty open-ended conversation where we're just going to chat about a handful of things and maybe start off with kind of a basic question, but one that's important to our audience. Probably about 2/3 of the people registered and attending today are actual sitting directors, some of public companies, some of large, private companies, and a smattering of others. So my opening question is, in the case of cybersecurity, for board members in particular, can you give us some distinguishing aspirations around what a board member might want to know and do versus what a maybe executive might want to know and do in this zone of cybersecurity versus maybe what a high-level IT professional in the same organization? And they have such different roles and goals. I wondered if you could outline those for us a little bit to level set.
Yeah, sure. So that's great. Thanks, Dan, for inviting me, and Nancy as well. Thanks for the introduction. Hello to everybody, and I hope everybody's staying safe and healthy. Here's how we look at it from a cyber perspective. So you have boards, management, and then senior level directors usually, and other people in the InfoSec or IT space, right? For boards, this is a classic, cyber is a classic category of the board's risk oversight function, right? So boards oversee risk. They have an obligation, as you know, the traditional good faith, fair dealing, et cetera. And in the cyberspace, it means being informed of the threats that the company faces, the evolving threat landscape, directing management, demanding from management that there be a plan and program in place to address those risks. And so just like the board handles financial risk and other areas of risk to the firm, cyber is one of those. It just happens to be so fast evolving and a little amorphous. And frankly, there's very little black letter about it, right? A lot of it is quite fluid. That's why we're here talking today. And so it's really having an oversight over those controls, et cetera, that manage that element of risk for the company. So that's board. Management then is charged with coming up with a plan and a program to address those risks, reporting to the board, informing the board, answering the questions that the board has placed on these areas, and really, at the end of the day, in charge of executing on the company's cyber program, compliance program, and risk mitigation program. And who does that? But of course, our army of extremely talented senior directors, VPs, and other folks who are actually in the IT and InfoSec space. So they're the ones doing the hard on the ground work. And so we think of these three sort of components as obviously critically working together. So I hope that helps kind of set the landscape of what different groups we think of as responsible for doing.
That's fantastic. In fact, it does a great job of setting the field for us. And let me ask a question, which is, I think I know your answer, and it's a little of a setup. based on the kind of hierarchy of having to do things, it sounds like in this story, the directors might not need to know a whole lot. And I wonder what your reaction to that is. And again, assuming your reaction is, "Ooh, hold on, Dan, that's a little more complicated." How do you distinguish between depth of knowledge, breadth of knowledge? I mean, as you said, this is such a changing landscape. It seems very, very difficult to land at the right level of understanding and knowledge. So is it the case, based on what you said, that directors don't need to know a whole lot, or is it something else?
So yeah, so I made the mistake early on in my career, Dan, in one of these sessions saying something like, well, boards and directors don't actually do anything, right? So I won't actually make that mistake again.
All right.
Really what I mean is, so if you're a board member, you're not actually charged with directly managing risk, right? In terms of designing and executing the program. That's what we just talked about, right? However, I think you absolutely have a duty, whether you're a public or private company director, big or small, any industry, anywhere in the world, you're a fiduciary, the highest level of trust that we recognize in the law, right? You're a fiduciary for that company. And so I do think you have to be well informed. You don't have to be a technologist, but do you have to understand the types of technology that are being deployed? Yes. You don't have to be a hacker, of course, but do you have to understand the types of threats and techniques that these bad guys use that could hurt your company? I think yes. The great news is that board members, very clear actually in the law and court decisions, can bring in outside experts, right? Outside experts and internal experts to leverage and gain that information. And that's really most of the game, because directors have a very, very well-honed skill. All of you directors out there, a very, very well-honed skill. Once you get the right type of information, you're asked the right type of questions, the questions that you all then ask back to management and staff are really insightful and get the company going in the right direction. So absolutely a duty to be well-informed, not necessarily technically knowledgeable, but that allows you to do your job.
Great. And that's a nice segue to my next question, because I think what you've highlighted, at the very least, directors need to be very sensitive if the risk landscape is changing, because it alters the fundamental set of questions they might ask, the zone of interest that they might direct their attention to. And so our focus for a big part of this discussion is the question as to whether or not the work from home phenomena fundamentally alters the set of issues that are at play in cybersecurity. And so that's my question to you. I think it's been mentioned in the news offhand, but you and I have had a discussion, and there's a range of opinion. Where do you fall on the idea as to how much impact, how much difference there is in cybersecurity issues in light of the work from home phenomena currently dominating particularly certain types of firms?
Yeah, so I think it's a fantastic question. I'll answer it this way. I was recently on a board call. The chairperson of the board started the meeting, and the meeting was going to cover a segment of cyber. And he said the following. He said, just like COVID-19 and the onset of the recession is fundamentally changing everything about the way that we have to think about our business from an operational standpoint, supply chain, all that kind of stuff. Of course, it's imposing those same type of black swan changes in the cyber context. And I think that's exactly right. Not only are we working from home, we've never had a situation where it's pretty much 100% work from home for many companies. And not only us, but 100% of 100% of our service providers, for some dozens, for others thousands, and 100% of 100% of the supply chain folks that many of us rely on, they're all working from home, right? So that's a big difference. And we'll talk a little bit more, I think, Dan, right in a bit about what that means for security. But consider this, it's different for the bad guys too. And they're leveraging techniques that are new and that are a bit unexpected. They're fast and furious, they're super well funded, and they're really, really good at their jobs. And I hate to say it, the bad guys are better at their job than the good guys, right? And so what we see are things like, massive onslaughts of exploits through O365. So this is the Microsoft cloud environment, right? And there's nothing to do with Microsoft. It supports remote working. We can access it on our phone, tablet, work from home, person, everywhere. Massive numbers of attacks going through the O65 infrastructure. Why? Because if you get into someone's email account on Microsoft O365, you also have access to their SharePoint files and other repositories of sensitive data. And we're handling way too many of these at my firm. And we're just seeing a sharp uptick. We're seeing tons of ransomware attacks because people know, the bad guys know that if you go in and lock up some really critical data, and that's how that works, right? They get into your system, they lock up some data that's critical to running your business, and they say, if you want it back, or if you want it back in time, you got to pay me a ransom, Bitcoin. A dramatic rise, and they're targeting things like supply chain. They're targeting financial systems within companies. They're targeting repositories of code and things like that that we just need to have, right? So they know kind of where the pain points are and they're going for it. There's something called business email compromise, BEC. The FBI says it's the #1 financial threat to all of us. This is getting into systems of either our own systems or service provider systems, sending emails saying, hey, the address or account number just changed, send the payment here. And it's remarkable, $26 billion of these types of transactions that were fraudulent just in the last 2 years. Literally, the FBI says this is the #1 thing, and they get in through various techniques that are new. We had a client that had an authorization for a $35 million wire transfer, and the bad guys were so good, they faxed the bank, not faxed, emailed the bank a PDF of someone's passport.
So my follow-up, therefore, is maybe for us to ask a poll before we get into some more nitty-gritty details. First of all, I like those examples, but let's maybe have Nancy put up an example of a question that we might have for everybody about their sense of security before and after work from home. Nancy, are you able to put up that poll real quick? Let's get some feedback, and then we'll jump into some more examples and details and what's driving it. This is a question about how you sense your company's doing about safety and cybersecurity before and after the situation with the work from home.
And I'll give it about 5 more seconds. We've got a lot of people that have already voted. Thank you. And then we'll close it here in just 3, 2, 1.
All right.
Well, we've got about 51% that say it's about the same as before work from home.
Okay.
24% somewhat less safe and secure. 13% significantly less safe and secure.
Okay.
And 11% somewhat safer and more secure.
I think maybe, Tony, my question to you is, what's your reaction to that response? That sounds pretty realistic, but maybe a little optimistic. What's your sense?
So I think it's very, very in line with the informal polling that we do across our clients, right? And it kind of makes sense because I think, especially if you're a director or an officer, right, in a company, usually what's happening is that you're being fed information from staff who are doing a wonderful job, by the way. The security infosec folks, the IT folks are doing a wonderful job in general, but you're being sort of fed information that, because the question usually is, how are we doing? And the answer is, we're doing fine. Here are the 1, 2, 3 things that we're doing. And I think what's being lost possibly in that discussion, and the reason why, I'm sorry, there's a...
Well, we saw someone behind you. I didn't want to say it was a cybersecurity intrusion. It was just an old-fashioned security problem. But I didn't want to be afraid for you. So I don't see them anymore. If you yell for help, we know where you live. We'll send someone to you. But
perfect. If video games start appearing on that TV back there, you'll know it's my 9-year-old playing.
We'll know what happened. Yeah, and we all empathize. So yeah, so this idea that you're getting fed information about how you're doing, that's fine, right? But
it's fine. And I think what's
set that? Yeah, how do
exactly. I think what is missing is, well, what is the actual risk that we're trying to address? And here I just want to share some information with the group. First is the research is unmistakable. Home networks are a disaster. There's public studies out there by various technology companies. Look, home networks used for business, 3.5 times more likely than a corporate network to have one family of malware on them, 7.5 times more likely to have at least 5 families of malware. These are malware elements that in the corporate network we've solved for because we spend a ton of money into visibility, remediating, patching, etc. They exist on home networks because not all of us are information security professionals that can really address those things. More than 25% in general of a gigantic sample size study of home routers had one or more services exposed to the internet. That means that there are open ports that bad guys can come and literally, I mean, by analogy, plug in and start working, right? And looking at traffic. There's another statistic, nearly 1 in 7 home IP addresses have administrative interfaces that are open. Again, these are very vulnerable networks, right? And the question that we ask in these situations is, what are we doing about that? And an answer we usually get, by the way, is, oh, we have VPN, so there's no problem. And we'll get back to VPN, I think, maybe a little bit later to address that.
I was going to ask that question. So let's put a pin in that because I definitely want to come back to that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So the VPN. Second is there's a huge amount of shadow IT that's being used. Unmistakable. What do we mean by shadow IT? If the company laptop or services or login or VPN, et cetera, crashes or it's delayed and you have a customer order you got to fulfill, you're on a customer service call, or you're engaged in some heavy duty coding that needs to get get into production right away, or any other number of really high intensity tasks. You're at home, you're distracted, et cetera. The use by employees of unauthorized third-party services, whether it's data storage, data transmission, word processing, the use of non-company issued laptops to get work done, it's massive, and it's a huge issue. We had a company where an employee used her daughter's home computer that's used for school to do a spreadsheet for a RIF, and tons of sensitive HR data across the board, anything you could possibly think of, right? And use a third-party sort of email service and a third-party document sharing. I want to be sensitive to not using names. Document sharing with a colleague, and we found out that that was exactly what was targeted, and the entire spreadsheet, which by the way had, hundreds of thousands of names on it, with what you can imagine goes on a RIF spreadsheet, right? Taken, right? And wow. This is this happens a lot, right? And think about shadow IT as if I had a nice moat around my castle and I could see everything that was going on. This is off moat, right? Off grid, and our talented InfoSec people can't see it. There's no visibility into it, and so it's really hard to control. That's another thing that we see. A second ago, I said 100% of our service providers are also at home. So it's like a multiplier effect. 63% of data breaches over the last 10 years have been directly or indirectly attributed to a third-party service provider. So just think about that. Even if we're doing a great job, what are our service providers doing about their security, especially the ones that we really, really rely on? Some 75% of information security professionals say that third-party breaches are increasing, and they're only going to further increase in the current environment where, again, we just don't have the visibility. So these are some of the things that I think maybe some of the questions that aren't getting asked that hopefully the folks on the phone go back to the companies and start asking and inquiring about and saying, how are we addressing these things? I think that's the fundamental essence, Dan, of the risk oversight function, as well as for management, what's our plan? And for those IT and InfoSec folks, what are we actually doing?
And let me jump in here because I always, on the one hand, think it's really important to highlight new and emerging risks. And this is a particularly unique moment in time. Like we pivoted into a whole new set of risks because of the new geography of this activity, right? So it's fair to talk a lot about it. But on the other hand, I always worry that we, throw too much scary stuff at folks and it can feel overwhelming or it can kind of numb you to it. So I wanted, out of the couple things you said, I'd love for you to highlight, and I think this is directed somewhat at the directors, members of the board, but really more at officers and executives. What are some of the strategies that do help resolve this somewhat? But let me start by saying, on the one hand, you've made lots of progress just by acknowledging that the risk environment is different, right? The only thing worse than, seeing that the risk environment is different and not doing anything about it is never knowing that you had a new risk environment. So I think knowing it is a big step. And secondly, I think there's not a lot of room for blame in any direction, especially at this moment in time, because frankly, it's, as you said, all a new game. So with that in mind, there's policy, there's action, there's follow-up, there's risk assessment. What are one or two things that can be done to mitigate or at least partially address some of the things you just highlighted? For example, this fundamental vulnerability around shadow IT. People need to get stuff done. Sometimes it's very hard to do so with the tools you have at your disposal from the company, because we had to move so quickly to work from home. Is there something that can be done either at a policy level or even at an execution level to address the shadow IT problem?
Yeah, there's a couple. So there's a couple of things. So we've had several clients actually think really hard about. Look, it's really hard to spend money in this environment, right? But this may be one of the areas that it's critical to consider spending some money. So we've had a lot of clients just go out and buy more laptops and soup them up with all of the different bells and whistles, the different tracking software, the different visibility software, et cetera, to make them more stable and to have the entire suite of security, right? So that our employees, when they're home, can work on more or less a secure laptop, right? That actually does have VPN and configured VPN in a way that doesn't expose the underlying machine, which is encrypted, from being compromised. And while typically we've had clients, for people who are in the C-suite or directors and et cetera, of course, right? Of course. But the question that we've seen is, even employees in call centers have access to very sensitive customer account information, et cetera. And many of them are just working on home computers that they share with the family, et cetera. And so part of this is, think about some capital investments that make sense, right? Or sort of investments into assets that make sense. And by the way, I think it's directly correlated to supporting the business and making sure that every sale that we make, quote unquote, is protected and that we don't have a lot of downside risk in terms of regulatory enforcement or brand reputational hits in the news, as we've seen some of our colleagues at some companies take because of privacy and security issues, right? And so that's one thing that we've seen. We also have seen pretty effective training around, look, the bad guys are sending you phishing emails titled information about COVID in your town, or here's our work from home, policy from the. They're very clever, right? And so training around, here's how we'll share information with you. Don't click on these types of things. Also, if you have needs around, shadow IT or what services that you think you need, let us know, because 9 times out of 10, I found the companies, we actually have the services available. We just didn't think that people would really need them, right? So I think those are some relatively low-hanging fruit that we can do to really dramatically improve our security posture. And that's really on the ground, but we want the board and management to ask those questions, right? What's changed? How's work from home? Are we ready for this? Are there things that we need to provide our employees? And what about our service providers? What are they doing? Are we checking in with them, the critical ones, right? So those are some of the things that we've seen that are quite effective.
Let me translate a couple of those points into some board level questions that can be asked. One of the questions that you can ask is, are there some trade-offs that have been made in light of budgetary constraints, and what are they? It's probably better than asking the question, what would you do if you had more money? That's a question probably directors should be careful about asking. But rather, what are the trade-offs that are being made in light of budget and capital constraints available right now? And if you hear something like, well, we're having to make do with what people had at home when we sent them home, maybe that invokes the discussion at the board level or certainly at the executive level about allocation of capital for the purposes that you raise. So I want to throw that out there. There's ways to get at this without accidentally, falling into the weeds and getting too technical. Let me highlight something that's happening in the security world writ large that maybe translates to cybersecurity, but I want your opinion. And that is that for example, have a friend who's just a fantastically successful retail convenience guy, runs a family-owned firm. They dominate in California for their sector, just an amazing family. But he and I were talking recently, and he observed kind of casually, oh yeah, theft is up, big time theft, like with guns and whatnot, that's also up, and petty theft is up. I said, oh gosh, is that surprising? He said, no, not at all, unfortunately. The economic cycle tends to provoke more crime. And my question is, and he said, this happens in almost all the retail sectors, and I had never thought of it. That makes a lot of sense. Is the same phenomena occurring in cybersecurity, right? We have the work from home, which is kind of an opportunity for the bad guys, but then we have kind of a stick that's driving people maybe to become bad guys, or the bad guys to work even harder. Is this cycle of kind of economic need also impacting cybersecurity activity?
Yeah, so I think it's a wonderfully insightful point. And the answer is yes. And we've seen it sort of over time that when there are economic factors that hit, or natural disasters, we've seen it that then directly turn into financial downturns. This sort of COVID thing, obviously, it's work from home, but it also has recessionary pressures. And yes, absolutely, and we see it not only in cyber where people actually, the bad folks, if you will, the hackers see it as this is a time when we know people will pay because again, every product, every sale counts. And so in the context of ransomware, for example, if we just lock up something that's really important, we can get a quick payday and move on. And by the way, there are entire networks of people on the ransomware side who all they want are $2,000 to $3,000, which is a lot to most Americans, but that's all they want, and they just want a repeat volume game, and they know that when times are tough, that they can really seize on this, right? But we see it in other contexts too, right? In terms of corruption is up, FCPA violations and things like that, when people are trying to strike deals, and maybe there are corruption payments and stuff like that become a reality, or even antitrust risk around working with competitors because we're trying to find joint solutions to issues. So cyber, I think, is right in line with those things, Dan, where the pressure to focus on revenue, sales, user acquisition, etc., has the effect of internally at the company possibly putting cyber slightly sort of lower on the rung, and on the bad guy's side, saying this is the time that we should strike. This is the time where we can actually do better, right, than the market, if you will.
Got it. So I have just a couple more points to make, and then we'll switch to questions from the attendees. So one question is, can you describe maybe there are long-standing best practices that haven't changed, or if there's some new ones, that'd be great, about how to expand the scope of assessment from the board view to accommodate this new expansion of, what people might call the cybersecurity attack surface, right? And is there something we should be doing differently at the board level to get a handle on what's going on, other than asking smart questions to the executives, or what do you recommend?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We've had several instances since the work from home dynamic has been realized, where we've done just that, sat in boardrooms together with board members, where we talk about here are some of the things that management is considering deploying to quote unquote address the overall attack surface, right? Part of that is technology is pretty remarkable on the security side. So I said earlier, the bad guys are doing a better job than the good guys. Well, that's true just because they can move more quickly and they're trying to do bad things. But the good guys have made a ton of progress. So there are technological tools, for example, that can do things like externally, without bothering anybody, scan networks for open ports, that can scan home Wi-Fi of known IP addresses for critical employees, right?
Yeah, because we've obviously been doing that, for the enterprise itself for a long time. That's like a standard practice. You miss that, and boy, you should be in trouble. But that's interesting. So pointing that kind of automated, vulnerability scanning at home offices for the right set of folks. That's a question a board member might ask, which is, are we engaging in any external observation scanning for our critical employees for their networks.
Exactly. That's one of the things that, and again, that is actually relatively cheap. Like we're talking, right? We're talking in the thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars, not anything more than that. So investment bang for buck is pretty good. And more importantly, I think for directors and not for Ds and Os, it is part of a program that tells a good story, right? In terms of doing something versus possibly having missed the opportunity to do something, which, by the way, we always see a lag of 1 to 2 years down when the regulators say, what did you do back then? Or the litigants say, what did you write? And so this is kind of setting that story up front. So there's things like that we've seen where technology can really help, right? Cover that attack surface. There's also other technology that we can actually arm our employees with that allows for other forms of data protection. There's DLP solutions that can catch if you are accidentally emailing or exposing certain types of information to a public facing internet site or outside of the or sending an email out, and actually stop it and quarantine it for a second for you to check and double check and then say, okay. So there's a variety of sort of like technology tools that are really effective, and just, straight training, unbelievably effective. I mean, it's really remarkable when we say, like, having a discussion with your 300 call center folks who are at home dramatically reduces, when we do subsequent anonymous testing, the click rate, for example, on phishing emails. And so I think these are just some of the things that we can just be talking about in the boardroom and with management about, have we thought of these things? Because something is better than nothing. And these seem to have some ROI that's supported by the research, which at the end of the day, I think is what the board and management team really needs to think about.
Fantastic. Well, I want to segue to a couple of our last polls and then go to some Q&A from the audience. And we've received just a couple of questions, but please take a moment now to maybe start throwing out the questions if you have them. My first thing I want to address, though, is I didn't give the normal, opening speech of IT security challenges, which is to say the goal is typically not to drive the rate of incident to zero, because Tony, as you and I know, that would be prohibitively expensive and probably impede all sorts of practical business function, nor is it to, when you get an assessment, to have a list that must be completed instantly. It's always a marathon and it's always a balancing act. And, the expectation is that there will be issues. The question is, did you mitigate them somewhat? Can you be resilient and mitigate them in process? Do you have plans for dealing with afterwards? So I didn't throw that out there, but I feel like I should, because I think some of the questions are going to address that. Before we do that, let's do our last few polls, Nancy, if you don't mind. I'd love to ask a question about the balance of what has happened after work from home and before work from home in terms of the balance of convenience versus security. Let's throw that up and get our participants to answer. And we're getting some great questions in, so we'll kind of go through those as soon as we get that poll asked.
Great. Yep, I just launched the poll.
Thank you. So Tony and I can't see it, so I'll remind us what it is. So it's, do you think your company is favoring, it's A, B, C, D, E, favoring security over convenience, somewhat favoring security over convenience, balancing security and convenience, somewhat favoring convenience over security, or favoring convenience over security? And those are the 5 choices. And we'll let Nancy run it for a second, close it out, and then tell us roughly what the results are. That would be great.
All right, we've got about 58% voted, so we'll give it 5 more seconds here.
We should probably have a I don't know or I can't tell you as an option. We probably get higher participation, but that's okay.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and end it, and then I'm going to click on share and see. Can you see it now, Dan?
Oh, yes, we can. Oh. Okay, host is sharing
great.
Okay. All right. Do you feel that your company is currently, so the plurality, 40% say balancing the two, 40% say favoring convenience over security. That's interesting. And a very small number on either end say favoring security over or favoring convenience over security. All right. So this question is just, again, you're not ratting out your board of directors. It is anonymous, but it's really just to get a level set of what you think. And again, a third of you are either senior level IT professionals or executives, and 2/3 are directors. So this is an answer from directors about their boards, and it's an answer from other people about their boards. So kind of 5 choices from, hey, my directors don't know as much as I'd like, all the way to, ooh, maybe they know too much. And I wish they'd stop asking me these very distracting technical questions that are better handled by the professionals. So we'll let people answer that real quick. And then just make your choice, hit submit.
All right, I'm gonna give you 3 more seconds and then we'll close it out. And here are the results.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we've got some folks who, 16% wish they really did know more. A majority, modest, needing improvement. Okay. And then, a pretty good plurality, good. Okay. No one said they have weirdly good understanding. That's expected. And then only 3% very good. Huh. Well, Tony, we would aspire, if you were kind of giving outside counsel, you would aspire to people to fall into the good or the very good category, I assume, right? That would be the aspirational. A great board would land most of its people in those 2 spots. Is that true?
I think that's right. And I think that's where the market is moving. That's certainly where regulators are moving, and where customers are moving, right? So here's what I think is really interesting. Why do we talk about this? Why do we talk about this so much? I completely agree with the results of your first poll question, which was favoring convenience over security, right? And most people are like, that's where we are, right? And I interpret that as, do we have to focus on our product or service over security? Hell yes. Do we have to focus on revenues and sales and getting things done in the market over security? 100%, because at the end of the day, our approach is always, if we don't have a company, who cares about our security? And B, if we're not a successful company, who cares about our security? And so the question, especially when we're talking to directors and officers, the question is, how do we create a story where we've addressed a lot of the low-hanging fruit, but we've also done things, asked questions, put in place programs and plans, management systems, et cetera, addressing work from home, shadow IT, vendor management, things like that, where we tell us a good story so that we're protecting sales, protecting those revenues, and we don't have to pay those out in the form of a reduced stock price or a fine, right, or litigation settlement, et cetera, to the same extent that we would otherwise. And here's another kicker. We've been involved in several of the SEC investigations into individual liability for CEOs, CIOs, CISOs, and senior level security professionals. The SEC, make no mistake, is developing theories that they've flexed in a couple matters. They're public, but I don't want to mention the names, but we've represented some of the individuals. They think that it's not enough to hold companies account, and they need to hold individuals account. Because
I'm of 2 minds about that, and I'm sure you are too. And I know you guys are on the defense side for that.
Totally.
On the one hand, this is a critical matter. It impacts, particularly when it impacts a large number of consumers. Sometimes it even impacts national security. But on the other hand, it is worrisome when you have a well-functioning corporate entity with well-intended and high-performing officers who might make a mistake that has tremendous consequences. But to have that equal direct and personal liability is a little bit disconcerting. I won't sit in place of judgment of the SEC, heaven forbid, but it is worrisome. Is there, in an abbreviated answer, because we got some questions along those lines, is there any broad approach that reduces that radically? It requires a perfect storm of a lot of stuff going wrong, but is there anything that companies can do that help protect their officers and executives in those scenarios in terms of either policy or preventive strategy?
So it's a fantastic question. The secret is that, and I want to be careful how I say this, but the secret is that there isn't a whole lot that the board needs to do to exercise what we call the business judgment rule and generally be shielded from shareholder liability, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't do nothing. Of course, no one here is doing nothing, but it does mean that adapting, the type of questions and inquiry around the type of risks that we're demanding that management execute on is important. Talking about it at, if not every board meeting, at least I think at this point, twice a year, to have minutes reflecting what was discussed and which expert was brought in, et cetera. The secret is that is a lot of what needs to be sort of done at the director level. At the executive level, I think it's a little bit more onerous in the sense that when we look at some of these investigations, et cetera, it's simply, it's kind of a negligence standard. Did you actually bother to understand really what happened or really what the risk profile is and whether these different changes due to COVID and work from home, et cetera, were reflected in your program, right? And so again, we talked a little bit about easy wins and stuff, and I think there are some. It's just how do we posture and pivot that and how do we document it to protect ourselves and therefore protect our companies?
That makes sense.
Great set of questions.
I want to jump to one of the questions. Yeah. Let me jump to a question. Although we are still going to ask maybe in a few minutes the whole. Do you think that your company's choice between the balance of convenience and security is the right choice? But first,
yeah.
I've got a question here that about third-party security assessment.
Yeah.
So the question is a third-party security assessment becoming a standard of care? To your point about negligence, and how would you identify such a third party? Let me preface this by saying that I've seen different approaches to this, including at the Silicon Valley Directors Exchange December annual dinner, in which they brought together some really high profile, IT security folks, one who's the CEO of a well-known cybersecurity firm, the other who is a former congressman who was kind of an intelligence, insider. They both said that this is absolutely a new standard of care. And my reaction was, I've always observed it as a best practice. But I'm curious, in your opinion, being right in the middle of it, has it slid to standard of care? Kind of like audit function. Like a public company could never get away without having an external auditor, obviously, right? Even setting aside the fact that that's codified. But difference between best practice and standard of care for this third-party assessment, meaning not penetration testing, but literally a firm comes in and says, let's look at your whole thing and here's our opinion. Yeah. I hate to preface it so much, but boy, this answer, I bet there are a lot of people on this webinar leaning in, ready for your answer. So what's your view?
This is the way I look at it, because I look at it in sort of reverse, right? When you see what the SEC has done in the way of some of the investigations, for example, in the financial services space, and the reports following that. When you see what the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, has done in its security orders against, Equifax, D-Link, RetinaX, the sort of .com place over the last 2 years or so. When you see what regulators like the New York Department of Financial Services have done. When you see what our customers, the largest of our enterprise customers, quote unquote, for those of us who are service providers, product providers, have required us to actually certify to in security questionnaires when they do business with us. When you have seen what the government, if you're a defense contractor or any element of what you do is on that, the certifications that are required, I don't see how a third-party security assessment is not part of the standard of care. Because in each of those different arenas that I just talked about, there is an explicit, right, if not highly implied requirement that you have a third-party objective team come in and look at your administrative, physical, and technical controls from a people, processes, and technology standpoint and identify risk in a remediation roadmap. You don't have to be perfect ever, but you have to be showing and making progress. And this is part of what, as a director, commissioning something like this or asking why aren't we doing it, and frankly helping even ask questions around and how should we scope this. We can't do the whole company, especially for a global multinational. What are the critical places that we should do this, guys, right? And how should we go about it, and who should we select? I think it is becoming part of the standard of care, and I say that not from a sort of wonky Delaware law kind of perspective, but at the end of the day, that's what is being required across the board. And so if you're the board, I think it's something that is within that sort of ambit of the standard of care that you should exercise. I hope that
I
makes
love the way
sense.
you framed that. That's great. And we're going to name your framing of looking at these other places the early indicators of emerging standard of care. I really like how you put that, which is, it really does, if you look to the folks who are more sensitive in a systematic way, they're the vanguard. And we know, where the regulators in turn will also look, they do that same thing. I want to reemphasize something you said though, which I think is really important. And that is, it is not a definitive list of what you should have done or need to have done immediately. It is instead, to your point, an assessment, which is about the landscape itself and an understanding of the balances and the trade-offs that are being made, which puts power and information in the hands of the board and in turn the executives, right? To make choices about spending, priorities, timing, to favor the success of the business, right? It is not an end in and of itself. And I don't, you and
it's
I
a roadmap.
this. Yeah, I don't want to overemphasize that, but it is easy to get carried away. And I think it's why some very sophisticated IT professionals are really nervous about third-party assessments, because they're afraid the board may take it as a gotcha list or a has to be done now list. And it's not that, right? It's a little bit broader and more nuanced than that might be. Do you agree with that? Does that make sense to you?
Yes and no. We have seen boards approach it exactly the way you said, which is with a view that, look, like Microsoft has Patch Tuesday, right? Meaning, the process of identifying vulnerabilities and patching them that's life, that's technology, that's across the board. That's nothing to be ashamed of. That's how we get better, and that's just how it works. Microsoft, one of the great companies in the world, has Patch Tuesday, literally, where they roll out patches to their vulnerabilities, right? So it's not that, and so we have directors that take that view, but there are other directors that are also I think, pre-assessment feel that their IT and InfoSec team have been selling them a bill of goods in the sense that everything is great. Like, we're doing all the things that we're supposed to be doing. And so there's a little mistrust. So I think, in forums like this and otherwise, providing directors and officers that context that, like, look, the staff are giving you a readout of what they're doing, and they believe that what they are doing are addressing the right risks. But until you really go in and get a diagnostic from a doctor where they hook you up to a machine or take a blood test and really tell you what's going on underneath, it's really difficult just via an interview or just in front of your face to see that you're doing all the things that you should be doing. And so I think having that open mind as a director and officer is really important, that you absolutely are paying someone, by the way, a fair amount of money to tell you how you can improve, not to tell you that you're doing everything great, right?
Right. And it's worth just throwing out a hook to kind of the legal, Delaware law issue here. And that is, if you are particularly a company that lives and dies by its cybersecurity, and increasingly more and more companies, this is the case. But if you're an online retailer, a financial institution, or someone who relies on reputation, trust, and actual execution, and if your cybersecurity suffers a terrible mishap, it can be broadly material, even devastating. If that's the case, then it's even more important as a board that you gather as much information that is realistic and accurate and timely. And again, there's lots of cases on this, but the one that comes to mind recently is the somewhat misnamed or miscalled Bluebell case, where if all you make is one thing, the things that are really dangerous in that environment, you should pay extra attention to, right? Which is, if you make ice cream and there's a type of food poisoning that affects things that are cold and is devastating, you should kind of double down on making sure you're aware of and sensitive to how to handle that. And I think that's the case here, right? So using kind of this Bluebell analogy, vulnerable types of firms probably should be doing extra. Is that still true in your view?
So what's really funny? I always get asked this question. Am I a company that is sort of like a really good target? I don't really think so. Or do I have the profile? And I say, okay, here's my question. Do you use the internet, and do you have computers hooked onto the internet? Because if so, yes, but I think you're right in the sense that there are certain technologies and companies where the entire sort of service or product offering is, for example, a SaaS model. The entire offering is virtual in the sense that no tangible product. It's global, it's crossing a lot of borders. And there's a need for a lot of people and entities to touch it, whether for customer service or servicing or supply chain, whatever, right? And I think for those types of companies, yes, because yes, it's a little bit more important in the sense that, in essence, part of what you are selling to your customers is security. It's an element of what you're selling, right? It maybe is not what you call the product is called X, but it's X plus security. And that's how the regulators kind of look at it. If your risk profile and kind of what you are offering to the public, and by the way, it's whether you're offering it to a shareholder or a consumer, is that privacy and security is actually embedded by nature in the product. And I really wish we could use names, right? But I want to be respectful of that. I hope that makes sense, because in essence, that's part of the offering that you're making. And so if you don't deliver on that, there's a real tangible business impact, and it could be existential to the company as a whole.
So the next question we're going to go to, I'm going to tell you, but then we're going to do our last poll. But I want to give you a chance to think a little bit about it, Tony. And that is, what happens if companies start to conclude that the work from home situation will persist for a long time? So whether it's a year, a little more, a little less, does that change your view of kind of the cybersecurity landscape, the things that boards should be thinking about? How should boards frame that? So that's the question I'd like you to answer next, but I think I'm going to turn to Nancy and ask her to pose the question, which is our last question. And again, to remind everybody, this is in response to the poll that said the balance between convenience and security. Whatever that balance is that you indicated your company has adopted, our question now is simply, do you think that is the right choice or not the right balance? So the balance that's been struck is what it is, based on your perception of the company's behavior. But now the question is, do you think that's the right one? So you can say, yes, it's the right balance, or no, not the right balance. And we'd be curious as to what your response is, and then we'll share that with everybody. Give you another 5 to 10 seconds. How are we looking, Nancy?
Pretty good. We're about halfway. So we'll do 5 more seconds.
Okay. If people are listening on their phone, it's harder to reply. So we'll give them a couple. Yeah, give them a moment.
All right. And 3 more seconds. Okay, and here are the results.
All right. Okay, so, about almost 2/3 think yes, this is the right balance, and about a little more than a third feel that no, not the right balance. Okay, just information. I'm more curious than anything else. Let's go to that question, Tony, if you don't mind. So what happens if this is the state of affairs for a year or more? Does that change your view on the cybersecurity approach here?
So I don't think it changes the view in terms of substantively what we've talked about in terms of boards, directors, officers, everybody being aware of the special risks that are posed and thinking about a game plan for how to address those, right? And by the way, one of those might be around, cyber insurance. There's a whole lot of things that you could be thinking of, right, in terms of sort of addressing that. But I think if we're in this for a long time, then especially for the folks that are on the phone now, there's some pretty significant implications. What if you're thinking about IPOing? What if you're thinking about doing a major M&A transaction? What if you're thinking about or bidding for a large government contract? What if you are in the throes right now of thinking of trying to pitch for major, Fortune 100 type business customer? When we look at the surveys that are taken out there, and we run some of the surveys ourselves, it's not uncommon for tens of millions, $100 millions to be knocked off purchase prices when there are pretty specific vulnerabilities that exist that we didn't know about. There's a survey out there that said something like 25% of directors would not acquire a company that had some serious vulnerabilities that they uncovered during diligence, or that hadn't bothered to look for whether they had serious vulnerabilities, right? There's 50% or so of respondents in this one survey said that they would do something to discount the target's valuation if something happened. So I think there's some real implications for, business strategy around some of these really things that our directors and officers are really paid to do, right? Think about strategic combinations, think about taking the company public, major, customer engagements and stuff like that. That's what they're paid to really do, right? That's how we, in a way, how we create value. And so, yeah, I think if this is longer term, these risks get sort of pronounced and enhanced, and it really should be part of the daily is an overstatement, the quarterly, biannual dialogue, and for management, close to daily dialogue about how do we get on top of this so we have a good story so that our business is strong.
Yeah, it's interesting because eventually the world will come to you. For many businesses, the world is a little bit paused, but if this goes on long enough, the unique cybersecurity implications of the current situation will suddenly matter more because of a new context. You're the target of an acquisition. You are deciding to re-up your lines of credit with your financial institution who has new covenants to look at. The world will move on and suddenly people will ask about this. So it isn't so much what more you should do, but rather it will matter in all spheres of your business operations, probably, as we move on. I think that's a great way of putting it. The final, so we have several questions, and we're going to address most of them offline. Some are very good. Everything from, hey, VPNs, kind of mixed bag. You make yourself vulnerable to some things, and we'll make sure we answer those offline. And some things about Zoom, improving security for Zoom. We've got a great document for that, so we'll make sure we send that. My final question in a minute's worth of answer, and I have 20 seconds worth of an answer.
Oh, good.
Is what about nation state activity, right? So there's been an uptick in nation state cyber related activity. My short answer tends to be, if that's the only category you're worrying about, you've been doing a great job everywhere else, and you just got to harden yourself. And at a certain point, you can't solve for everything. So I don't want to ever be dismissive of it, but the nation state bar. Nation states have what we call kinetic on the ground assets. So if the cyber part doesn't work, they break into someplace and they steal it. So that's hard, right? So my answer often comes off as snarky, and I don't mean it to be, but rather, boy, if that's all you've got left to worry about, good for you. What's your company name? I want to invest. Like, that's great. What do you do though when someone asks you this? It says, hey, I hear there's a lot more nation state stuff. Should I be doing more at the board level? Should I press my officers and executives to do something? Is there a good answer to that right now? And that's going to be your last answer.
Yeah, it's always a concern because they are the most well-funded group. And what's scary about nation state attackers, and I think think about kind of what industry and what you have going. They don't care about necessarily about making money on the spot in terms of, they're not interested in stealing credit card numbers or social security numbers. They're interested in your intellectual property. And so if that's something that's really important to your company, which for most companies it is, especially tech companies, but other companies as well, that's what they want. If you have, designs on doing business in places, right, where there are nation state actors supported, North Korea, China, et cetera, right, places of Africa. They absolutely come after clients. They steal designs, et cetera, and they produce copycat products elsewhere. And again, in a recessionary time, think about the incentives to do this. They're massive, right? The other thing about nation state actors that I think we have to be sort of, mindful of is that, they are increasingly attacking companies that you wouldn't just on first guess think about. In COVID, if you are anywhere near a vaccine, they're after you. If you are anywhere near any element of contact tracing, any element of community sort of health, thereafter, they want that information for their own nations, if you will, and you're vulnerable. If you're anywhere in this sort of healthcare chain, et cetera. So think about, the sort of, even the nation state, attackers around elections and stuff like that. Anytime there's a situation like this, nation states are a threat because they're going after really some crown jewel type stuff, both with your company and politically and even in the healthcare environment. And so I'll leave you with that.
And I'll wrap it up because you and I talked about before, a couple of the points that you made, and I feel like I pressured you not to make them all, were that, nation state response requires such a level of specialization and sophistication that almost certainly almost any company is going to be resorting to a third party, highly specialized third parties to help them with that above and beyond even the traditional best practices. I've heard the joke, preparing your company for nation state intrusion is a little bit like performing your own appendectomy. Really not advised. You need a third party who's highly specialized and really knows what they're doing. And even then, it's really kind of just hanging on and trying to be responsive. But we'll end on that slightly depressing note, although a light at the end of the tunnel, which is, if you're on this webinar, if you took the time to listen to these things, I think, at least for directors, it's about being informed and asking the right questions. And that gets you really quite a ways down the path of doing a great job and helping your company thrive and survive. And Tony, thank you so much for taking the time and working with us. We really appreciate it. And we hope to maybe talk to you again sometime soon.
Great. It was a pleasure. Wonderful questions. And thanks so much, Dan and Nancy. Really appreciate it.
And thanks to everyone who joined the webinar. We really appreciate you taking the time. Sorry for going a few minutes over. And we will try to tackle all those questions that appeared. Nancy, any final wrap up?
I just wanted to say a big thank you to Tony and to Dan, as well as Oric, and thank you to our community, and hope everyone can stay safe and healthy. We'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.